Something significant is happening inside the Western alliance right now. It is not happening behind closed doors. It is not being whispered in private diplomatic channels. It is playing out in public, in parliamentary votes, in official government statements, in press conferences broadcast live to the world. The coalition that was expected to present a unified front behind the United States and Israel in this conflict is no longer doing that. And the divergence is no longer marginal, it is structural. This is not about one country expressing reservations. This is about the accumulated weight of multiple allied governments across different political parties, different histories, different strategic interests, arriving at similar conclusions and stating them openly. Today, we are going to examine that picture methodically. We will look at Turkey, at China, at the major European powers, and at what the combination of all these developments reveals about the current state of the Western alliance. We will not editorialize. We will follow the evidence where it leads. Let us begin with Turkey, because Turkey's position this week represents one of the most consequential diplomatic signals of this entire conflict. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan made a public statement declaring that Turkey holds what he describes as a moral obligation to respond militarily to Israel's ongoing military operations. That language, moral obligation, military response, coming from a sitting NATO head of state directed at another country that the United States considers a core strategic ally, is not ordinary diplomatic friction. It requires serious analysis. First, the capability context. Turkey is not a rhetorical actor without military weight. It operates the second largest military force within NATO by personnel count. It has a domestically developed drone program, the Bayraktar series, that has demonstrated operational effectiveness in multiple conflict zones, including Libya, Nagorno-Karabakh, and Ukraine. It maintains a significant naval presence in the Eastern Mediterranean, and crucially, it holds both Russian and American military hardware simultaneously, the Russian S-400 air defense system and American F-16 fighter aircraft. That dual alignment gives Turkey genuine strategic ambiguity and leverage that most NATO members do not possess. So when Erdogan speaks, he is speaking from a position of real capability. The statement is not empty. The more interesting question is why now? Throughout the earlier phases of this conflict, Turkey maintained a carefully calibrated posture. Erdogan expressed sympathy with Palestinian civilians. He criticized Israeli military conduct, but he stopped short of the kind of escalatory language we heard this week. He was managing his relationships with Washington, with Moscow, with Tehran, with Riyadh, keeping multiple channels open without fully committing to any single position. What appears to have changed is the diplomatic elevation of Pakistan. The decision to hold the Iran-United States negotiations in Islamabad rather than in traditional neutral venues, Geneva, Vienna, Doha, gave Pakistan a significant profile boost at a moment when leadership of the broader Muslim world's response to this conflict is being actively contested. Pakistan hosted the most consequential diplomatic negotiation currently underway. That is not a small thing. Erdogan has spent years constructing Turkish foreign policy around the idea of Turkey as the leading voice of the Sunni Muslim world, the heir to Ottoman diplomatic tradition, the country that speaks when Arab states are constrained by their security dependencies on Washington. Islamabad just stepped into that role, and Erdogan's response follows a recognizable pattern. When he feels diplomatically marginalized, he escalates publicly to reclaim visibility. His statement this week is, in analytical terms, as much about Turkey's positioning within the Muslim world as it is about the specific conflict. It is a signal to Muslim-majority populations globally that Turkey was not silent, that Turkey did not look away. Whether military action follows is a separate question, but the statement itself functions as a strategic act, regardless of what comes after it. The China dimension of this week's developments has moved from background concern to front-page reporting, and the nature of what is being reported represents a qualitative shift in the conflict's external dynamics. American intelligence assessments, reported this week by Reuters and the Wall Street Journal, describe China as having provided Iran with cruise missiles and advanced air defense systems. This is a meaningful escalation from previous reported levels of Chinese support, which had focused on dual-use technology and smaller-scale military equipment. Cruise missiles and next-generation air defense platforms represent a different category of capability transfer entirely. China's foreign ministry, responding to questions about these reports, stated that Beijing is, quote, not satisfied with how the United States has managed the diplomatic process. In the language of Chinese official communication, that phrasing is a deliberate signal. It is calibrated to be pointed without being inflammatory. It is Beijing telling Washington, clearly and on the record, that its conduct has consequences and that China reserves the right to respond to those consequences through its own actions. The American response to these reports has been analytically notable for a different reason. Rather than a clear denial backed by counter-evidence or a clear acknowledgement backed by a stated strategy, the public response from Washington combines skepticism with threats, specifically a threat of additional tariffs. That tariff threat is worth examining in context. Earlier in this conflict, the United States threatened China with tariffs at the 140% level. China responded by restricting exports of rare earth magnets, not all rare earth materials, specifically magnets. The downstream effects of that restriction threatened American defense manufacturing, satellite production, and advanced electronics supply chains. The administration publicly acknowledged that China holds an effective global monopoly on rare earth magnet production and that domestic American alternatives would require, at minimum, 1 year of concentrated investment to develop. The tariff escalation was subsequently walked back. China observed that sequence. A follow-on tariff threat from the same administration at a lower threshold, from the same starting position of documented leverage imbalance, does not function as a credible deterrent. It functions as domestic political communication. China's strategic calculus here is not primarily about trade, it is about energy. A decisive American military outcome in Iran would give Washington significant influence over approximately 20% of global oil supply. Chinese energy security depends substantially on access to Iranian and Gulf oil. The cost of accepting that outcome, in terms of long-term strategic vulnerability, outweighs the cost of 50% tariffs on Chinese exports to the American market. That is a strategic calculation Beijing is capable of making. What happened across European governments this week deserves careful documentation because the accumulation of individual positions has produced something larger than any single statement. Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez called formally and publicly for Europe to end its strategic partnership with Israel. His argument rested on a consistency principle. Europe has applied a comprehensive sanctions framework to Russia for its military conduct in Ukraine on the grounds that territorial expansion by force and targeting of civilian infrastructure violate international humanitarian law. Sanchez argued that the same framework applied consistently requires a comparable European response to Israeli military conduct in Gaza and Lebanon. That argument does not require agreement to be taken seriously analytically. It identifies a real structural tension in European foreign policy. The credibility of a legal principle depends on its consistent application. Selective enforcement weakens the principle itself, regardless of the political or historical reasons for the selectivity. Italy's Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, made a statement that was, in many respects, the most analytically significant of the week, not because of its content alone, but because of who said it. Meloni leads a party with roots in post-fascist Italian nationalism. Her government has been among the most hawkish in Europe on security questions. Her historical instincts on Middle Eastern policy have aligned with the American and Israeli position more closely than most European governments. This week, she stated publicly that Israel has, in her assessment, violated the principle of proportionality through a large-scale military campaign that is producing civilian harm at a scale Italy finds unacceptable. She announced Italian support for European Commission sanctions. She called for a permanent ceasefire and an internationally managed post-conflict process. When a politician takes a position that is ideologically uncomfortable for them, the decision carries more analytical weight than when a politician takes a position that aligns with their existing worldview. Meloni's statement does not reflect a change in her values. It reflects a judgment that the observable evidence on the ground has made the previous position indefensible. Ireland formally recognized Palestinian statehood and recognized Jerusalem as the Palestinian capital. France issued formal criticism of the Israeli offensive in Lebanon. Spain, Italy, France, and Ireland, together representing a substantial portion of NATO's European membership, are now formally on record in opposition to current Israeli military conduct. Germany has remained largely silent. That silence is analytically significant in its own right. Germany's historical relationship with Israel, rooted in the moral reckoning of the post-war period, creates genuine institutional and political constraints that other European governments do not face in the same way. But silence that was previously the mainstream European position has now become the outlier position. That shift changes the meaning of the silence itself.
When a NATO member state publicly declares a moral military obligation to attack a country that the United States considers a core strategic partner, and the American response is effectively absent, no formal diplomatic engagement, no publicly stated consequences, no visible alliance management, that absence communicates something. There are two analytically coherent interpretations. The first is that the internal contradictions within the alliance have accumulated to a point where the standard tools of American diplomatic management, bilateral pressure, economic leverage, institutional framing, are no longer sufficient to contain them. That the combination of military costs, financial strain, and political divergence across allied governments has produced a situation that exceeds current American diplomatic capacity to manage. The second interpretation is that back-channel negotiations are underway that reframe the public statements as part of a larger diplomatic process not yet visible to outside observers. The observable evidence, the contradictory public statements from Washington, the absence of visible diplomatic engagement with Ankara, these simultaneous escalation signals from multiple directions without a coherent counter-strategy, does not strongly support the second interpretation.
There is a conceptual distinction worth drawing clearly, because it tends to be obscured in public discussion of this conflict. The question of whether Israel has a right to exist as a state within internationally recognized borders is not a contested position among the governments we have been discussing. That right has been affirmed formally by virtually every government in the world. It is not what is being debated. What is being debated in the European Parliament, in Sanchez's speeches, in Meloni's statement, in international legal proceedings, is specific military conduct, specific questions of proportionality, specific questions of civilian harm, specific questions of territorial expansion through military force. These are legally and morally distinct questions. International humanitarian law exists precisely to address these distinctions. It does not suspend itself because the state conducting military operations is a democracy, or an ally, or a country with a documented history of facing existential threats. Pedro Sanchez's consistency argument, whatever one thinks of his politics, identifies a real structural problem. If the principle underlying European support for Ukraine, that military force cannot legally be used to seize territory, that civilian infrastructure cannot legally be targeted, applies only when the violating party is an adversary and not when it is an ally, then the principle is not a principle. It is a policy preference dressed in legal language.
The global south, where the majority of the world's population lives and where the majority of the world's future economic and political weight is being built, is observing this choice being made in real time, and the conclusions being drawn there about the gap between stated Western principles and actual Western conduct will have long-term consequences for international institutional credibility that extend well beyond this specific conflict.
The picture at the end of this week is one of compounding complexity. China is reported to be supplying Iran with advanced military equipment. Turkey, a NATO member, has made a public threat of military action against an American ally. The major European powers have broken, openly and formally, with the American position on Israeli military conduct. An international legal body has issued an arrest warrant for a sitting Israeli prime minister. Russia continues to provide material support to Iranian forces. The financial cost of the conflict has exceeded levels that were publicly projected at its outset. And the diplomatic architecture that was supposed to contain this conflict, the alliance relationships, the shared legal frameworks, the institutional mechanisms of Western coordination, is under a level of stress that official statements from any capital are not adequately describing. None of this tells us how this ends. Geopolitical situations of this complexity rarely resolve according to the trajectory they appear to be on at any given moment. Diplomacy, even when it is not visible, can produce outcomes that observable evidence alone does not predict. What it does tell us is that the framing of this conflict as a campaign proceeding toward a defined successful outcome within a coalition maintaining meaningful unity does not match the observable record. Documenting the gap between official framing and observable reality is not advocacy for any particular outcome. It is the basic function of analytical journalism. We will continue to track these developments as they unfold.